Okay, so this morning we're going to look at the first round of discourse between Job and his friends. The first two chapters of Job are the introduction, and so there's 3 rounds between Job and his friends that lead to chapter 28, which is the center of the book of Job. So Job chapter 3 is really Job's lament. All this stuff has happened, and again, the more you read of what happened to Job, the more you're just blown away by what Job experienced. And a lament is a response in the ancient Near East of when your life has totally been destroyed. He's lost everything. Put yourself in his shoes. He laments. He puts it into words. And there's a series of wishes in verses 3 through 10. He says, I wish, let that day, etc., etc. That's a refrain in verses 3 through 10. And then in verses 11 through 26, he has a series of questions, 11 through 26. Why this? Why that? Why did this happen? And then, we talked about last week, his friends show up from afar and they sit in silence for 7 days, which is remarkable. I don't know that any of us could do that. And in the ancient Near East, the custom was that the person mourning would break the silence. So if someone was going through something, say Libba was going through something traumatic and you were there to visit with her and grieve with her, you would let her speak, right? You don't want to enter in, you allow her. It's a respect issue. And so Job is the first one to break the silence, and he speaks. In chapter 3, it says lament. You can compare it to some of the laments in Jeremiah, chapter 20, or there's a book of laments, Lamentations, specifically Lamentations 3, over the fall of Jerusalem. God's city falls to like the worst people on the planet. There's a lament over that. And so as you look at his lament, verse 3 refers to the day that he was born, and his father would have announced his birth to everyone. It would have been a celebration for Job's father. Job says, it was a disaster that I was born. That's how bad his life is. I mean, it's really quite a picture. And then in verse 8, tons of scholarly articles for you to pursue on this in your leisure time. Leviathan, again, plenty of scholarly articles. Some see it as the dragon of chaos from ancient Near Eastern myths. Others see it as a large sea animal, perhaps something like a crocodile, which there's a town north of Caesarea, I'll make sure I say this right, called Crocodilopolis. Crocodilopolis, meaning they had a crocodile. So that there were some reports of that, and Pliny the Younger records that there was a stream there in that city called Crocodilian. So they had a Crocodilian Creek. So some people have said, okay, if we're trying to make an animal out of this, is it a hippo? Is it a crocodile? I don't know, but there's plenty of Old Testament scholars who have been in their lexicon and have been in their study for years and years, who have written scholarly articles. Pursue that on your own time. It's interesting for some, others are not as interested. So verse 10 is a summary statement of the misfortune of his birth. That's a pretty depressing statement. And then in verse 11, Job changes his perspective from cursing and being upset to questioning. And so the progression of Job's thought is as follows. He wishes he had not been conceived, but then the progression goes, if he was conceived, he wished he would have died in the womb. I mean, it's pretty negative stuff. Or if that couldn't have happened, the progression of Job's thought is it would be better if he died immediately after being born. And finally, since that doesn't happen, Job progresses to say, I wish I would have been killed much earlier. That's the state of his life. And again, when you read Job, don't read it as, he had the flu and he had a bad day, or he had the virus, or he had a car wreck and he had a bad day. It is, his whole life is taken from him. So that, just to keep that in perspective, that may be redundant. And Job here recognizes in verse 13 through 19, that death is the final equalizer for everyone. For the poor, for the rich, for the ruler, for the servant. No one escapes it. No one escapes it. And so in 14 and 15, he contrasts kings and counselors, builders and princes. In verse 17 and 18, criminals and the exploited, the wicked, the overworked. And so there's as we've talked about last week, there's a chiastic pattern, an inclusio pattern here in verses 14 through 19. A, B, B, A. About privileged, underprivileged, small and slave, great and master. So far in chapter 3, Job has written about how intolerable life is and how death is desirable. Then as you look as his thought progresses in verse 20 through 26, Job asks why any of this should even happen. In a sense, Job is asking, why should the result of God's gift of life be that those who have life wish to get rid of it? So a bit of philosophy really here. Life and light in these verses are equated in these verses, since death is equated with darkness. Job's suffering has led him to believe that death would be a relief. Again, it can be pessimistic to read this chapter, but you have to, again, just put yourself in Job's shoes and realize how much he has experienced, how much he's lost, everything. Then in verse 23, he reveals this bitter struggle he's having with his experience. He refers to those whom God has hedged in. If you remember back to chapter 1, that word hedge was also used. Who used it? The accuser, the Satan used it and said, God, you've hedged Job with protection. You've hedged him with protection. But if you took that away, now Job says he's being hedged in by God. Verse 25 reveals that Job is terrified of losing one thing, the favor of God. The favor of God. So chapter 3 ends. We're going to get to Eliphaz here in 30 seconds. Chapter 3 closes with very sharp Hebrew clauses. It could be translated in English as, this would be a literal translation, kind of a New American Standard. It would be, I cannot relax, I cannot settle down, I cannot rest. Agitation keeps coming back. That's really the tone, the feel of the end of chapter 3. I cannot relax, I cannot settle, I cannot rest. Because not only has he lost everything, but he doesn't have much of special revelation, what we call much of the Bible. We don't really know when Job was written. So he might have had the Pentateuch. He might not have even had the Pentateuch. He doesn't have much to go on, so he has no answers to the questions as he has. So then we get into chapter 4 and 5, Eliphaz, the first man up. And the speeches that you see here in rounds 1, 2, and 3 that lead us to chapter 28 are really in the ancient Near East known as contest literature. Contest literature. It's a form of debate where you try to have the best response, the best answers. And that really was kind of like we have debate teams today, right? It's really that. And so as a result, in that culture, speeches were judged by their quality, their cleverness, not always by their effectiveness. So Job chapter 4 and 5, again, there's always, you may get tired of me saying this, there's always structure to it. And the envelope structure, the chiastic structure is the opening statement in chapter 4, verse 2. Then the second part is the exhortation, verses 3 through 6. Verses 7 through 11 of chapter 4 is God dealing with men, which leads to the center. So there's 3 parts, center, 3 parts. The center of Eliphaz's speech is in chapter 4, verses 12 through 21, the revelation of truth. That's his main point, the revelation of truth. And then the parallel sections to finish chapter 4 and 5 is chapter 5, God dealing with men, verses 1 through 16, just as he had talked about in chapter 4, 7 through 11. And then the closing exhortation, just like there was an opening exhortation, is chapter 5, 17 through 26. And then just as there was an opening statement, there's a closing statement, chapter 5, verse 27. So if you look, we're going quickly. We'll stop here early so we can have some discussion. So we'll cover a lot of ground, then we can talk. Verses 3 through 4 are a tribute to Job's reputation and his ability to help others through their own trials. Okay? In verses 6 through 7, Eliphaz endorses Job's faith in God and reminds Job that he has lived a life according to the principle that God helps the good and punishes the bad. Right? God helps those who helps themselves. So the insinuation already towards Job is that Job has done something wrong. That's already implied in his argument. Then in verse 8, Eliphaz asserts that he has not observed any exceptions to this rule. This, right? This always happens. Always. And then in verses 9 through 11, Eliphaz uses an illustration because he's...
What chapter are you?
4. Chapter 4, verses 9 through 11. The animals who prey on others eventually fail when they encounter the breath of God. So he uses an illustration to bolster his point in chapter 4. And then Eliphaz continues. He does something unpredictable. He appeals to mysterious personal experience to demonstrate his knowledge. And he describes a supernatural experience he had one evening when he was asleep. And so there's some echoes there from other Old Testament passages like Genesis 15 with Abram and also 1 Samuel 26. And he says, the Spirit came to Eliphaz and speaks to him. And it's an eerie description that he continues in verse 16 as he describes a visible shape he cannot discern and a voice which is silence. That's an amazing picture. And so one commentator says that after this dramatic buildup, we would expect to learn some great mysterious truth. He is a Gnostic. He knows something that he's going to impart to you. He knows something incredible. Instead, what you get is this truism. You get this statement, is man more just than God? Really? That's the best you have? Is man more pure than his creator? Of course not. You've not brought anything new to the table. That's not scholarly research there. We know that. So Eliphaz begins to sound pretentious, if he hasn't already. Chapter 4 closes, or it ends, with a reference to the frailty of humanity. He says it's like a moth or a tent held up by a cord. And so Eliphaz in chapter 4 has asserted the incomprehensibility of God, which Job agrees with, by the way. He's going to agree with that. However, Eliphaz goes a step further and asserts that God cannot be bothered, even by angels, in verse 18 of chapter 4. His logic leads him to the position that men are not that important to God. That's the logical conclusion, that you are not that important to God, and that even the justice of God is remote and distant from humanity's understanding. And Job, as you will see, does not agree with this. In chapter 5, Eliphaz becomes more direct with his words. In chapter 5, verse 1, Eliphaz asserts that it is futile for Job to call out to God in prayer because God's not listening. God's not listening. You're messed up, Job. So since Eliphaz has just given Job private revelation from God, remember we just saw that a minute ago in chapter 4, Eliphaz is asserting that he is qualified to receive revelation from God, but Job is not. That's the underlying subtext here. He's the true follower of God. Job is not. Verse 7 of chapter 5, Eliphaz claims that trouble and calamity, it's inevitable, Job. It's inevitable. It's going to happen. Verses 9 through 16 is a creedal hymn that he writes. And it's one of the clearest passages in the book of Job. And that leads to, again, we're going quickly so we can cover some ground and then we'll have a lot to talk about here in a few minutes. It leads to verses 17 through 26 where Eliphaz celebrates the righteous man who receives the troubles of life in the right spirit. And you can compare that with Psalm 94:12 or James chapter 1, verse 12. So Eliphaz asserts that everything comes from the hand of God. The problems we encounter and adversity that individuals encounter in the acts of God, God brings us those. And the solutions he lists in verses 23 through 26 are listed in the inverse order from the problems that he had mentioned in verses 18 through 22. So 18 through 22, he's listed these problems. 23 through 26, he gives the solution in inverse order. So he begins, if you look back to chapter 4, he began by addressing Job personally. And then he's lecturing Job and preaching to Job. Here in verses 24 through 25, Eliphaz says that Job's tent, which is a euphemism, it's for his family. His tent, his family and his animals will show no loss if Job just responds the right way. Job, all this has happened, and if you will just respond the right way, things will work out for your good. He also adds that Job's offspring will be numerous and live long and good life if your response is good. Again, these are tough words to give to Job. Again, as you read through Job, put yourself in his shoes hearing these things. It's not helping. John Chrysostom, who was an Eastern Orthodox, revered in the Eastern Orthodox Church from the 4th century, John the Golden Tongue, or Golden Mouth, said this. He said, notice how Eliphaz has inflicted a severe blow on Job by showing that Job is not among those who receive a warning or among those who keep faith. Indeed, Eliphaz has applied his words to the person of Job, but his speech has a general meaning. For he says, Eliphaz says, here's what we have seen and understood. But if this did not occur in your case, Job, and if you remain in your misfortunes, it is up to you to recognize your own perversity. Job, here's how life works. If you can't figure it out, it's on you. Imagine someone in your living room telling you that when your family's been killed and you've lost your job and you've lost everything. And actually you've lost your house, so you're not even in a house. Those words do not go over well. And then notice here how Eliphaz concludes his first speech by using the word we. He's speaking for others who possess this wisdom, and he's very confident in what he's saying. Eliphaz believes he knows how to get along with, this is a key here, Eliphaz believes he knows how to get along with a predictable God. This is how God operates in the universe, Job. If you just do this, A and B, C is the result. If you've been a Christian longer than 5 minutes, you know that doesn't work, right? So Eliphaz has this not bringing wisdom here. Doctrinally, Eliphaz has some issues. He's trying to defend God's justice, but he's applying it and coming up with theological arguments that will not work. His failure as a counselor, it is a failure as a counselor to his friend Job that gets him in trouble with God later in chapter 42. God will have harsh words in chapter 42, verse 7 for Eliphaz. And God's going to say, your words do have an element of truth, but are they healing? Are they helping? The answer is no. You would not want Eliphaz as a counselor for you during a difficult time. Let's look at Job's response. We'll go quickly through this so we can stop and talk for a little bit. Job's response in this first round of speeches is chapters 6 and chapter 7. Okay, a man who's just lost everything has just been told what we've just covered from Eliphaz. How does he respond? Typically in the book of Job, Job's responses are given twice as much coverage or length as the initial conversation. So Eliphaz speaks, it might be, these are hypothetical numbers, it might be 200 words in Hebrew. Job's response is longer than 200 words in Hebrew, maybe 250 or 300, just hypothetical. Job is given more of the spotlight in his responses. And partly because what you see in Eliphaz and the other men that counsel him, those are used in the literature from a literature perspective as foils to Job's counter argument. So Eliphaz speaks, it's a foil to what Job will say. Job is who you need to really listen to. So the speeches of Job here face the reality of a relationship with God that is much more honest, that you can be a follower of God and things do not go well. We know that. We know that. For Job, his fundamental problem is not his loss of health or his loss of family or his loss of property. That's a positive statement about Job. It appears that Job's primary problem is how to understand his relationship with God after all this has happened. That is a statement of Job's faith. Because if you lost your family, lost your house, lost your job, lost your career, the tendency, just speaking generally here, the tendency in our culture today is to wonder why you lost it or how do I get it back. Job does not seem concerned as much with that as he is with God, which speaks to his faith. He has a loss of certainty about God's goodness, and he wants to know what's happening. So Job's response in these 2 chapters indicates that he is hurt by the words of Eliphaz, obviously, and he responds with an emotional outburst. Job's he's not a computer, he's not a machine, he's a person who has feelings, and when he's just lost everything and a friend just starts to pile on, gradually but then piles on, he is going to respond. So Job insists in chapter 6, verses 2 through 7, that his words are justified, that death is better than life in verses 8 through 10. And he concludes with his disappointment with Eliphaz, because that's left him more desperate than ever, verses 11 through 23. You've not helped, Eliphaz. Go get me a cup of coffee. Maybe you can help. All right. So Job here in chapter 6 appears terrified, really. He appears terrified. In verse 4, he describes God as one who is dressed for battle and shooting arrows at him. Have you thought of God that way in your life? That God is in the military chariot in battle against you. Have you felt that way? That's how Job is describing this. And Job has one desire. We saw that in chapter 3, and that is death, which is really honest. In verse 15 of chapter 6, Job asserts that his friends has proved as reliable as a wadi stream. And those are the streams that were dry riverbeds. And then when there was a heavy rain, they would flood up and then they would be gone, right? It's like a rushing torrent. He says, you're as reliable as these riverbeds, meaning they're unpredictable. Because you could be washed away and people would die. Children might die if they were washed away in these riverbeds during the rain season. He says, you're as helpful as that, predictable as that. In verse 16, Job gives us a hint that he lives, this is according to one scholar, there's a hint here that Job lives somewhere east of Lebanon because he records the language of snow and ice, which would not be found south below, like say, Edom, the Edomites. So again, that's just speculation from one scholar that perhaps he is east of Lebanon where he would have encountered some snow, encountered some ice, and had some, it's hard to know, but it's an interesting thought. In verse 19, he compares his friends to desert merchants. from the place of Tema and Sheba, who look desperately for water in the desert, just as someone in the desert who's traveling with merchandise looking for water. Job is desperately looking for consolation. He's looking for friends that will help him as he's lost everything. In verse 21, it's the punchline for Job's comments. He says that they have become nothing and are afraid. Again, very honest response from Job here in chapter 6. So chapter 6 ends with Job telling his friends that he did not ask for gifts or a bribe from anyone. Perhaps what Job is saying is that since he is not indebted to his friends, he's not indebted to anyone, he's going to speak openly. Does that make sense? Because I'm not in your debt, I don't owe you money or I don't owe you anything. You're going to get an honest response from Job. He's not going to play it safe. So let's go through chapter 7 quickly, and then we'll stop so we can talk about this or have some discussion. So, chapter 7 begins, but now. Most of chapter 7 is a soliloquy that turns into a complaint against God. So the theme of chapter 7 turns gradually towards a complaint against what God has done. Job's primary theme begins with hard service and difficult time that we have as humans on earth. That's how it begins, and then it shifts towards his views on God. The words that Job expresses in the chapter are similar to the words of the preacher in Ecclesiastes. Koheleth is the word there in Ecclesiastes. Some similar language. So one scholar makes an interesting point here of chapter 7, contrasting what Job is saying theologically and what Eliphaz is saying theologically. Job believes, for example, that everything good and bad comes from God and that God maintains or takes away what he has given. As a result, Job affirms against Eliphaz that it is impossible to control what God gives or takes away through our actions. That sounds moderately reformed. Moderately reformed, that God is sovereign. And we talked about that on our topic of Christian freedom. I think I quoted Calvin. Calvin says, be content in the position in life that God has given you. Meaning, if not to strive for poverty if you're poor, but to say, if God has not given you a ton, be content with that. If you have enough to eat and to live, be content with that, Calvin says. Calvin also says, if God has given you a lot, use it to God's glory. Don't feel like you have to. We talked about some of the things Calvin mentioned. Don't be afraid if you have a lot. You can wear a nice shirt or nice clothes. You can have a nice bottle of wine. That is not sin. But use it to God's glory. So what Job is saying is he's an early proto-Calvinist. That everything we have comes from God, and it's up to God to give, to take away, which is definitely something we believe. Verse 11, Job says, in his pain, Job says, I will not shut up. I'm only going to speak louder. You have in Job a fighter. And there's a reference here to the sea god or the sea monster that are ancient pagan myths that are enemies of God, that are prevalent in ancient Canaanite mythology that he references here as enemies of the true God, not real gods, enemies of the true God. And then in verse 13 and 14, Job says, even in his sleep, he does not find rest or escape. Even in his sleep, he doesn't find rest or escape. Verse 17, what is man that you make much of him and that you set your heart on him? Does that have an echo of anything in the Psalms? Psalm chapter 8, you hear the echo of the psalmist. What is man that you are mindful of him, the son of man that you care for him? Yeah. So consistent theology here for a man who does not have 66 scrolls to pull out. The scroll of Genesis, the scroll of Exodus, he doesn't have that. He might have the Pentateuch, we don't really know. The final verses of chapter 7 of Job's speech come back to the initial question of why. Job has already asked his friends in chapter 6, what sin have I committed to deserve this? If it's all conditional with God, which is much of American Christianity today, much of global Christianity, conditional Christianity. If you do this, then God will, which is not biblical. Job says, if it is conditional, what sin have I committed? Point it out and I'll confess it. And now he asks God that question. And what Job is doing, we'll finish with this. Job, clearly as we read through most of you, I think, have probably read through the book of Job. Job knows he's a sinner. He's not claiming to be perfect. Job knows he has sinned, but he does not know why God will not forgive him because we looked at it in chapter 1, he's offered sacrifices for his family's sins. He has done everything he knows to do to atone for sin. So why will not God forgive him if the theology of Eliphaz is correct? And so Job is appealing to God to make his misery, his suffering, endurable by making it meaningful. If you don't have meaning, and you guys remember the famous book written during the Holocaust or after the Holocaust of people that survived it in the camps.
What you talk about describes the South at the end of the war between the states. My great-great-aunt lost 3 or 4 sons. They were so poor they had to dig up the dirt under the smokehouse and boil it to get the salt. The Yankees had taken all the hams and bacon out of it. I mean, you talk about no job, land is, crops destroyed, children killed, and how, in 150 years we've forgotten it. I haven't forgotten it, but most people have forgotten what we endured or had to endure, and I think it's a testament that they did. And when people talk about reparations and all that, we shed a river.
Yeah, we're not going to get into that.
I know, but we shed a river of blood in those 4 years.
Right.
And the suffering that they went through, nobody, of course that's not taught in the history books, but what you were saying so much reminds me of what they had, but of course they did have scripture.
Right. Yeah, you need solace. Let me finish with this and then we can jump right into discussion. You need meaning in the midst of suffering. And so man's search for meaning, written after World War II, was the people that survived, some of the people that survived being imprisoned, it was because they had a meaning to live for. And those that didn't, if they escaped the chambers and were just trying to survive from starvation, the people that survived typically were those that found a meaning for living, something beyond this. If they didn't, there's no hope. And you guys have seen probably some of the footage from that. It is unbearable when you watch the Holocaust footage. It's unbelievable. Let me finish with this. Job is appealing to make his suffering knowable. One scholar says, and I want to quote here, Job is in the right. He does not know that God is watching with silent compassion and admiration until the test is fully done, and it is time to state Job's approval publicly. So Job doesn't know what's going to happen. He's in the midst of it and wants answers. He doesn't know that God is watching silently and God's going to speak to him. In the meantime, it's hard. Last thought, Jesus might have had this thought in mind in Luke chapter 22, which as we're studying through Luke, we'll probably get to this before the next pandemic. Luke chapter 22. Job may have had this in mind when he tells Peter that Satan wants to sift him like wheat, but he has prayed for Peter that his faith would not fail him. Remember that at the end of Luke chapter 22? Jesus says, Peter, I've prayed for you that your faith will not fail you. Your faith in me. Faith is not a spiritual commodity. Faith is in a person. So let me stop there. Next week we'll jump into Mr. Bildad in chapter 8 and look at that. But let me stop there so we can have, say, 10 minutes or so to have some discussion or questions.